This afternoon, for our Yom Kippur Martyrology service, we are pleased to welcome Mary Maudsley, Esquire, to Temple Sinai to present her topic, The Holocaust, Prosecuting the Prosecutors. A graduate of Temple University School of Law, Ms. Maudsley has been an attorney since 1974. While practicing law, she earned a Master's of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Stockton University in 2003. An adjunct professor at Stockton for the past 21 years, she has taught a number of Holocaust-related courses, including genocide, war crimes, and international law and the Holocaust in film and literature. Her professional papers include The Holocaust in the Courtroom, Famous, Infamous, and Unknown Trials, and Rabbi versus Historian, a Holocaust libel trial. An accomplished litigator experienced in commercial, family, municipal, and ethics matters, Ms. Maudsley served as chair of the New Jersey Supreme Court Disciplinary Review Board as solicitor to the Atlantic County Ethics Board. Please join me in welcoming Mary Maudsley to Temple Sinai.
Made it. Thank you so much. One of the things about getting a little older is I'm a little slower, so I appreciate the help and also the cane. So anyway, I've made it up to the pulpit, and I want to thank everyone for how kind they have been. The rabbi has been very kind to me on the telephone when I asked a lot of questions. Lori, my greeter and my keeper, has been very kind to make me feel immediately at home. And looking at everybody here, I'm so pleased that you braved the rain to come out and hear me. Can everyone hear me? Okay, just checking. If anyone can't hear me during the course of the talk, raise your hand and I'll adjust the microphone or try to speak louder. My topic is the Holocaust, prosecuting the perpetrators. And when I say prosecuting the perpetrators, I'm thinking I really want to say prosecute the perpetrators and punish them. But that's not always what happens. And I'm going to talk about the reasons for that, the main reason being that all of the Holocaust-related prosecutions are inextricably intertwined with the politics of the time and the place. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and there's going to be time for questions at the end. So if you have questions, make a mental note of them while I'm speaking. The first and most famous trial of the perpetrators is the International Military Tribunal, which tried the many of the higher up Nazi perpetrators. You've probably heard, I'm sure you have, of the International Military Tribunal, which was a combination of the four victorious powers after World War II. Now, when I say to my students, who can tell me who the four victorious powers are, they can't always answer. Many of them get three, and they forget France after they say the United Kingdom, the United States, Russia, and France. They were combined to conduct the International Military Tribunal, which was the first and only trial before the International Military Tribunal. I'm going to probably call it IMT for short, but that's what I'm talking about. Now, when the IMT convened to try the top Nazi perpetrators, there was a great deal of discussion as to who should actually be on the list of defendants. There was a lot of discussion about who represents what and who is really too old to be tried. I don't know if there is any such thing. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But they ended up with 22 defendants, And after a lengthy and very famous trial, the result was that 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death. 10 of them were actually hanged because one of them had committed suicide before the end of the trial. And Hermann Goering, who was, of course, in charge of the Luftwaffe and very instrumental in the destruction of the Jews, he took cyanide the night before he was scheduled to be hanged. It was theoretically smuggled into him by a friendly guard. No one knows for sure, but that seems to be the general consensus. So it ended up that 10 of the defendants were hanged, 3 were acquitted, and the rest of them were serving long or longer sentences in prison. Now, probably the most well-known of those people you have probably heard of, and that's Albert Speer. Albert Speer was Hitler's architect. When he first met Hitler, he was a professional. Hitler admired him. He admired the fact that he was an architect, and Speer got sucked into or jumped happily into the circle of Hitler's confidants. And at the time of the Nuremberg trial, he's the only one who expressed remorse for what had happened. And I say what had happened, that's the passive voice, intentionally, because he never really took responsibility. He never really said, this is my fault. What he said was essentially, and I don't speak German, so I only have my own translation. What he said was, I'm so sorry this happened. I'm so sorry that I got sucked into Hitler's inner circle. I never should have been so foolish. Woe is me, and I apologize to all concerned. That's as far as he got, and yet he was the only one that expressed any kind of remorse, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, as opposed to people who had done much less damage to the Jews of Europe were sentenced to death. So Albert Speer is sometimes referred to as the good Nazi. I do not refer to him that way. And there's been considerable discussion since his death as to how remorseful he was and whether it's ever possible to express remorse for the 6 million Jews and several million others who were murdered during the Holocaust. So that's why we've all probably heard of the International Military Tribunal Nuremberg Trial. But it was not, I mentioned politics at the very beginning. This is not necessarily a popular undertaking at the time. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court said that, I have to read my notes here with my glasses. This is Harlan Stone, and he said, the Nuremberg trial was a sanctimonious fraud, a high-grade lynching. Now, we've heard that phrase, high-tech lynching, which I suspect that Clarence Thomas may have borrowed from Harlan Stone. But his argument against the Nuremberg trial was that it was victor's justice. In other words, the victorious powers all got together and, I'm paraphrasing now, beat up on the losers. And he was opposed to that in principle. He said it was a, did I say this, sanctimonious fraud as well as a high-grade lynching. He refused to swear in the American judges who were sitting at Nuremberg. So the assistant, the second in command in the Supreme Court swore them in, but he refused to have anything to do with it. Now, another name you may be familiar with is William O. Douglas. William O. Douglas also objected to the first Nuremberg trial. His was on the grounds of this is a ex post facto law. and that is all of the defendants were tried under the Nuremberg Charter, and that's the law which was adopted by the Nuremberg court, and it was the law under which the defendants were tried. That law consisted of war crimes, and crimes against humanity. There's a third which has just gone out of my head right now. And it's the crimes against humanity that the Nuremberg court became famous for. But the argument that William O. Douglas made was this law was not a law at the time the crimes were committed. It was passed ex post facto, and therefore he thought that it was outrageous that defendants should be tried for crimes that were not crimes at the times they were committed. And he said it was substituting power for principle. So he was never on board with the IMT Nuremberg trial. The reason that trial is famous is that it established crimes against humanity as an international law violation, but that wasn't the original reason for the first Nuremberg trial. The original reason was to establish for the world that starting a war is a violation of the law. Basically it was aggressive hostilities that was intended to be the main purpose of the Nuremberg court. However, what happened, and we know this from the diaries of some of the people involved, one of the judges involved in the IMT Nuremberg trial described it as a citadel of boredom. And the prosecution was prosecuting this only by reason of captured documents. They used the documents that they found after capturing the top Germans. They used the documents to show that they had planned to wage an aggressive war. So there's this parade of documents and translations, that's a whole nother story, but they were all translated so that all the judges could hear and understand their attempt to wage aggressive war. However, because it became a citadel of boredom, and the reporters who were there from all over the world started making excuses to leave. They'd go to lunch and not come back, for example. Not that there was much to lunch on in Nuremberg at the time, but they were just desperate to get out of the trial. So the prosecution made the decision to get everybody's attention again. And to do this, I have to go back slightly and explain that when General Eisenhower, you probably already know this, when General Eisenhower discovered the concentration camps and the death camps, he insisted that pictures be taken and a video be made. And because he did that, the Allies made a short film called Nazi Concentration Camps. And that Nazi concentration camp film is the source of what you have probably all seen in documentaries and on TV. What they did was put all the clips together that Eisenhower had taken, made a film called Nazi Concentration Camps, and as everybody was leaving and snoring and falling asleep at the trial, the prosecution decided to liven things up, so to speak, and to show that film. And they did show the film, and the reaction in the courtroom was devastating. A lot of people began to cry. One woman fainted, and suddenly the reporters who were out looking for lunch all came back, and they stayed there for the entire trial. And that's how the crimes against humanity really got its foothold and is what the original IMT Nuremberg trial is famous for. Now, there were several subsequent Nuremberg trials, but they were not by the IMT. Anybody know why not? Don't worry, I won't call on you. Just asking. It's because as Winston Churchill described it in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, the Iron Curtain had descended, and therefore there was, I want to say literally, but it's really figuratively, an Iron Curtain between the USSR and the other Western allies, and they never again cooperated on anything, at least until the fall of the Berlin Wall decades later. So there were no more IMT trials because they couldn't get together and form a court. So the United States military courts held the remainder of the Nuremberg trials, and those were the trials of the USS military, the doctor's trial, the judge's trial, the industrialist trial, the army trial, the SS trial. And the one trial that you may be familiar with through media was, there's a film made, I think, in 1961, but don't write that down because the date may be a little off. And it starred Burt Lancaster and Spencer Tracy. Judgment at Nuremberg, it was called. And it was not a depiction of the IMT trial, it was a depiction of the lawyers and judges trial. And in the film, we begin as the viewer to have a little bit of sympathy of one of the defendants, whose name in the film is Ernst Janning, and who in real life is Burt Lancaster. And the prosecutor is Spencer Tracy. So what happens during the film is we get to have a little bit of sympathy for Ernst Janning. He explains how he was sucked into the Nazi cause, how he never really intended to be the enemy of the Jews. And as we're watching it, we're manipulated into having a little bit of sympathy with him. However, at the end of the film, he's convicted, of course, and he meets with the Spencer Tracy character, and he says to him, I just wanted you to know that I never thought it would come to this. I want you to understand that. I never thought it would. And Spencer Tracy says to him, it came to this the first time you sentenced a man to death whom you knew to be innocent. So that is a brief account of the Nuremberg trials, and where politics fits in is, of course, the disputes about how the trial should be conducted, who should be the judges, and whether or not there should be a trial on an ex post facto law at all. So there was a lot of criticism, and that criticism concerning trials of about the Holocaust did not cease at the end of the Nuremberg trials. The next trial I want to explain about is Canada. Canada tried only one case under its war crimes statute. The one case was someone named Imre Finta. He was a Hungarian who had caused the death through rounding up, ghettoizing, and deporting over 8,000 Jews. And he was tried in Canada because he was living in Canada at the time of the trial. Canada had just passed the War Crimes Act, and so they try Imre Finta. And what happens is he's acquitted, even though it's not disputed what he did, but what is disputed is, was he acting under orders? And the Canadian law says that's not a defense unless you could not disobey the orders, unless they were completely compulsory. And that's what the jury found. And when they appealed it to the Canadian equivalent of the appellate division, same thing, he was acquitted. And so the Canadians got discouraged from prosecuting any further war criminals, and that was the first and last trial in Canada. It was not the end of the trials, of course, in the rest of the world, and one of them is a civil trial, and it's important to our discussion for reasons which I'll explain. There's a man named Rizo Kastner. Has anyone heard of the Kastner Train? Oh, good. We got one person at least who's heard of it. Rizo Kastner was a Hungarian, and he decided that he would save all, count them all, of the Hungarian Jews. And his plan for doing this was to advertise to the Jews around the world and make money or take money from them through their contributions and use it to bribe Adolf Eichmann and also an SS officer called Kurt Becker. And he was unfortunate, or I should say unsuccessful, in raising enough money to save all of the Jews of Hungary. But he was able to raise enough money and to finagle sufficiently that he was able to hire one train, and 685 passengers were aboard that train. And that train saved all those 1,685 passengers. But it wasn't quite that simple, because the train was supposed to go to Switzerland, but instead it went to Bergen-Belsen. But it stayed there only for 3 months. I say only, even though 3 months is a long time, but they did not die at Bergen-Belsen. Because of the intervention of the SS officer, they were able to resume their travel and to reach Switzerland eventually, where they all were saved. Now, why would this be controversial? Why would it be the subject of political discussion? First of all, because many members of the train, at least, well, I say many, at least a dozen, were members of Kastner's own family. So he was accused of using money raised by the Jews worldwide to save his own family. His response to that was he wanted the other people on the train to feel safe, that it was safe to ride. But nonetheless, that was controversial. Nonetheless, they all survived, and why does this matter to us? Because Kastner then moved to Israel after the war was over and took a job with the Israeli government, a low-level job. And there was someone in Israel who owned a small newspaper. His last name was Greening, and Greening's newspaper had a circulation of about 200, so not a world shaker in publications. But he wrote an editorial in his little newspaper saying Kastner is guilty of treason because, first of all, because he didn't tell the Hungarian Jews that they were all going to die. And it was known to some people at that point in Hungary that they were all going to die if they were deported by the Nazis. And the reason they knew this was two men named Wexler and Verba escaped from Auschwitz, and they prepared what are now referred to as the Auschwitz Protocols. And it's an account of the trains going into Auschwitz and coming out empty. And they counted them. Verba counted them, counted the trains, estimated the number of people packed into each of those freight cars, and estimated the number of people who were dying in Auschwitz every day. So Kastner had knowledge of the Auschwitz Protocol for reasons which I can't speak long enough to tell you, but suffice it to say he was aware. And he was accused by Greening of not telling the Hungarian Jews so that they could make their own decisions about their fate. Should they rebel? Should they take up arms? What? So Greening's theory was that Kastner had committed treason and he had betrayed the Jewish people of Hungary by not telling them what was happening. Now, when this was published, this little editorial by Greening in his paper of 200 people, Kastner, now employed by the Israeli government, said, I don't care, let's just leave this alone. You know, who wants to discuss this? It's only 200 readers, plus or minus. And the Israeli government said, wrong, we can't have an employee of the Israeli government being accused of treason and of betraying the Jews. We're a Jewish country, can't have this. So we, the Israeli government, and you, Kastner, are going to join together and we're going to sue the newspaper for libel. So they did that much to Kastner's reluctance, and I'm coming to the point of the story here. Kastner lost, and when he lost, the judge in the original case, his name was Benjamin Halevi, you'll hear that name again in just a moment, he commented, however, that Kastner had made a deal with the devil, and the devil that he was talking about was Adolf Eichmann. So he, on the record, publicly called Adolf Eichmann the devil and said Kastner has made his deal with the devil. Well, they appealed, and it was a long appeal, but at the end of it, Kastner and the Israeli government won, and they said it was libelous for Greening to have said all these things. But Kastner, in the meantime, was assassinated by apparently someone who believed the editorial written by Greening. And where does this fit into prosecuting the perpetrators? Here it is. The judge in that case, Benjamin Halevi, who had called Eichmann the devil, he was appointed to be the judge in the trial of Adolf Eichmann that we're about to come to. Now, how could he be a judge when the defendant is a man that he said is the devil? Obviously, that's a problem. But the Israelis are practical people. They passed a law immediately that said there have to be 3 judges in this kind of trial, not just one. So Halevi was sharing the judicial duties with 2 other Israeli judges when Eichmann was brought to trial. Now, I say that really casually, when Eichmann was brought to trial. Of course, you probably know the story. Eichmann escaped from Europe, probably with the help of the Vatican rat squad, although that's never been completely proved. But in any event, he made his home in Argentina under an assumed name. He went to work for Mercedes-Benz. He lived in a very, how shall I call it, low-level rented cottage, and he expected to survive there for the rest of his life, except for the fact that the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad, got a tip from somebody who knew somebody that one of Eichmann's children was dating, and slipped this information to the Mossad. So the Mossad went to Argentina without, of course, their permission, and extricated Eichmann, of course, again, without the Argentine government's permission. And they spirited him out of Argentina. But when I say spirited, it was much more complicated than that, because their plane was delayed, they ran into all kinds of difficulties, and they had to hold on to Eichmann for 3 or 4 days while he's trying to get away, of course, and escape and, shout to anybody who will listen, I'm being kidnapped. But they successfully removed him from Argentina, got him to Israel, where he was put on trial in 1961. The most famous trial after the original Nuremberg trial. And it was different from the original Nuremberg trial in several different ways. First of all, he was accused of crimes against the Jews, or I think it was crimes against the Jewish people is what the statute actually says. And he was live and in person in a glass booth, as you probably have heard, to prevent him from being assassinated. And the Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, had 2 major goals with this trial. Now, why, you say, is the Prime Minister intervening in the judicial system? Well, that was permitted, or at least David Ben-Gurion was strong enough to make it happen. He wanted 2 things to happen with this trial. He wanted, first of all, for Israel to be acknowledged as a legitimate and potent state. Israel was only 13 years old at this time, and he wanted the world to see, look, Israel has got this guy, and they are trying him, and they're going to execute a sentence, quite literally. And we want to show the world that Israel is, although a very new country, is a potent country. And secondly, he wanted the world, literally the world, the watching world. Television was very new, but people were watching it on television. He wanted the world to know what had actually happened during the Holocaust. Now, it wasn't, I'm referring to it as the Holocaust, but it wasn't called the Holocaust at that time. That shorthand term had not come into, and not emerged into common use. So what Ben-Gurion wanted to do was to show the world what had happened to the Jews of Europe. And he wanted them to see personal accounts and have a real understanding of what happened. And he directed the prosecutor. I know that sounds like anathema, but this was Israel in 1961. He directed the prosecutor to produce witnesses, live witnesses, none of which had been at the Nuremberg trials, to produce live witnesses to tell what happened to them during the Holocaust. So the prosecutor produced 110 live witnesses, not just a sample, but I don't want to say a horde because that has wrong connotations, a gang, a lot of survivors, all of whom told their personal tales, what happened to them, what happened to their families. And although the outcome was the same for most members of their families, the stories were different. Different things had happened to them in different ways, different people they'd had contact with, different Nazis, and different collaborators in all of the European states. So they all told their stories, which is what Ben-Gurion had had in mind, and not one of them, you'll be shocked, not one of them had anything to say directly about Eichmann. 110 witnesses, not one of them had seen Eichmann commit any crimes, not one of them had talked to Eichmann or even read anything that he wrote. They just were talking about their experiences, and the prosecutor said that is enough to show that he committed crimes against the Jews because he was in charge of the transportation of all of the Jews to their ultimate destinies. So Ben-Gurion got what he wanted. Everyone was paying attention. Practically anyone in the world who had a television was watching. One of the advantages of my advancing age is that I was alive then and I watched this on television. And it was shocking and alarming, and people did wake up and pay attention. And Eichmann, of course, was convicted. He was hanged, and he's the only defendant in Israeli history that was ever hanged. Israel does not prevent the death penalty being used. It's on the books, but it was only ever used for Eichmann, which I think is symbolic and highly appropriate. So the Eichmann trial concluded with the success of Ben-Gurion, a foothold on his government by Ben-Gurion, and Eichmann was the last and most famous person to be executed by the State of Israel. Now, that trial was covered famously by Hannah Arendt, who was a philosopher and reporter who sat through part, not all of the trial, and she wrote a series of pieces for The New Yorker about the trial. And the subtitle of her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, is The Banality of Evil. And whether Eichmann himself represented banality or evil, for that matter, has been the subject of a lot of discussion among scholars and historians. And no one has ever concluded for sure whether it's proper to call his participation banal or whether he was actually actively evil and conducting personal evil against all of the Jews of Europe. Now, Eichmann's position was, Arendt's position was very controversial. Number one, she said that this is a show trial. It wasn't a real trial because the outcome was foreordained. Nobody testified directly against Eichmann, and yet he was convicted and hanged. So she thought it was a show trial. She argued, bear with me. She argued that the Jewish councils, which were councils formed by the Germans in order to carry out the Germans' orders, but they did it through the Jewish councils. She said that the Jews were, as she implied, she didn't directly say, she implied that the Jewish councils were as responsible as Eichmann himself for the death of the European Jews. So you can imagine how much discussion her book engendered and still engenders today. That's the major book written about the Eichmann trial and whether or not he is the banal face of evil is still under discussion. But mentioning the Jewish councils, and I see I have a little bit more time, mentioning the Jewish councils brings me to another extended story, although I won't extend it, I'll truncate it, extended story of a man who was tried for war crimes. And this is a trial that I've done some personal research about. And what happened is this. In Hungary, and you have to remember, the Hungarians were the last Jews alive in the Holocaust. They were, Hungary was allied with Germany. The Hungarian Jews thought that they were not going to be murdered because, after all, Germany is their ally. It's 1944. The war is practically over. Everybody knows who's going to win. The Russians are surging in from the east. I mean, you're looking at it this way, the east. And the Americans are coming through Italy. And so the war is about to end, and the Jews didn't quite sit back and breathe easy, but they really thought they were going to survive. But what happened was Hungary was probably about to change sides like Italy had done. Hitler got wind of it, and he invaded Hungary on March 19th, 1944. And with that invasion came Eichmann 2 days later and 170 assistants, basically SS and Gestapo. And with that, Eichmann and his 170 people, they deported and murdered over 600,000 Hungarian Jews in 2 months. During this time, there was an unfamous, unknown, never heard of rabbi in the south of Hungary. And this rabbi was kind of a double agent because he made friends with a Nazi down in Szeged, which is where he lived in the southern part of Hungary. He made friends with this Nazi, and this Nazi got him onto the Jewish Council in Budapest. Why, you say? He didn't live in Budapest, had nothing to do with Budapest. He was very unpopular with his own congregation. He had to sue them twice for his own salary. But nonetheless, this Nazi got him onto the Jewish Council in Budapest. Making a long story slightly shorter, after the war, he was tried by the People's Court in Hungary for various actions that he had done in his double agent capacity that aided the Nazis and aided the destruction of the Hungarian Jews. They tried him in the People's Court and found him guilty. He appealed to the equivalent of the appellate division in the People's Court. And what happened then was that the leaders, the surviving leaders of the Hungarian Jews, appealed to the appellate division, and they said, please don't convict him. Please, please, because he's a rabbi, and there's so much anti-Semitism in Hungary now, which there certainly was even after the war. There's so much anti-Semitism that to have a rabbi convicted of war crimes is just going to be awful, and it's not going to help the anti-Semitism situation in Hungary. So they promised to the appellate division that if they would vacate his conviction, he'd been sentenced to 10 years, by the way, and he burst into tears during the pronouncement of the sentence. Anyway, they said to the appellate division, please, please don't convict this man, and if you let him go, if you vacate the conviction, we will get him out of Hungary. And that's exactly what happened. They got him out of Hungary. They set him up in the United States. He changed his name. He lived in the United States. There is more to the story, but I think I'm running out of time. So let's just suffice it to say that the Jews escaped in Hungary. The surviving Jews, which were mostly Budapest Jews, escaped having a rabbi having been declared as a war criminal. So that I'll end that story at this point, and I want to reiterate my original point, which is that all of the trials having to do with the perpetrators of the Holocaust, all of them are inextricably entangled with politics. The national level politics, local level politics, there was politics at every step of the way. And while I'd like to think that the perpetrators were brought to justice, it's not that simple. Many of them escaped justice entirely. They had their sentences commuted or were never rounded up and never tried. And the circumstances surrounding their trials were full of political dissent and discussion at the highest level. So that concludes my thought that you can't keep politics out of the courtroom when you're talking about the perpetrators of the Holocaust. Whether this is good or bad, I'm not saying. I think that's something we all have to figure out. But that's my conclusion, and I'm ready for questions. If you have questions, please have questions. I'm set for questions. Thank you. Yes.
If anyone has any questions, great.
Do you work with the Simon Wiesenthal Center at all? And are there any perpetrators that we're looking for to this day that might still be
Good
around?
question.
Or relatives of those perpetrators? It's another topic.
First of all, do we have all day or all night? I'm not associated with the Simon Wiesenthal Center at all. I've been teaching as an adjunct at Stockton for 20 plus years in the Holocaust and Genocide program. So I'm interested, but not participatory. But the second, it went right out of my head. What was the second part of your question? Is there any? Oh, yes. Germany right now, right this very minute, is advertising for people who were related to people in a particular death camp, which the name of which escapes me. They are trying a guard at that death camp known only as NN, and he is 99 years old. And they're advertising because they want to put him on trial, and this is the German government. They want to try him, and they're looking for survivors or survivors of family members. So yes, that's the effort is still going on. I should mention, not should, I'm just filling the time till the next question. One of my very, very dear friends was a Hungarian Holocaust survivor who died just shy of his 96th birthday. And he was asked when the question came up, what about these old guys that are now being tried in Hungary and in Germany and elsewhere, and some of them are in their 90s, is that really right to do that? And my friend said, absolutely it's right. The sin, he didn't use the word sin, he said the crime never goes away. And if they're still alive to be tried and there are people willing to try them, damn right they should be tried. That's his opinion, so of course I adopted it. But I think that is my moral opinion as well. Yes?
Why would you say that Germany wouldn't have been the Why do you think that Germany wouldn't have been part of the ITM? That's what you called it, like along with America, United Kingdom, Russia, and France.
Well, because they were part of the Axis powers then. We were the Allied powers, and the Axis powers were led by Germany and the Hitler government. And so there was no way, and this is why the Chief Justice called it Victor's Justice, there's no way that the United States was going to include their immediate former enemy in this process. Again, Victor's Justice, and that's a legitimate criticism, I think. Other questions? You've got one back there?
How did you get involved in this study originally?
The study of the rabbi and the Hungarians?
The Holocaust at all.
Oh, the Holocaust at all.
What attracted you to this part of it?
That's easy for me to answer, but a little bit hard to explain. When I was in 9th grade, which was like 1959, I think, I was in 9th grade, and my uncle had a book called The Wall by John Hershey, and it was about the Warsaw Ghetto, a fictionalized version, but it was very detailed, and it was absolutely fascinating. And being in 9th grade in the 1950s, I had no notion of the Holocaust or anything about it. And reading that book absolutely opened my eyes. And I started reading everything that I could about the Jews of Europe. It wasn't called the Holocaust then. And there were mostly memoirs that were published. But by the time I was in 9th or 10th grade, I could safely and truthfully say I had read every single thing written about the Holocaust. Every book, because there were so little, so few. The first scholarly works were written in the 1960s, and before that it was mostly memoirs. And I found these through used bookstores. Every time I went to a used bookstore, I would delay everybody while I checked all the shelves for memoirs. And that's really how I got interested. Other questions? Yes, you need the microphone back there.
Thank you. Of all the people that were, and you might have answered this, but I don't remember, all the people that were on trial at the Nuremberg trial, how many were actually convicted?
At the first Nuremberg trial, there were 22 defendants, and 19 of them were convicted. 3 were acquitted, 12 were sentenced to death, and the remainder of them were serving sentences in prison. The longest serving defendant is a man who his name has gone right out of my head, which is why I was avoiding talking about him, but now here we are. I forgot his name, but he flew to England to try to make peace with England while he was still part of Hitler's government. And he was tried at the Nuremberg trials, and he was sentenced to the longest prison term. I think he died recently. By recently, I mean within the past 10 years in a prison in Great Britain. His name will come to me as soon as I leave, but right now it has
Also, were there
escaped me.
any Nazis that were tried in the United States? I remember reading about Ivan the Terrible, but I don't remember the details, so I was just wondering, in the United States?
Oh, yes,
were
that's a whole separate lecture, and the short version is that Ivan, again, his real name escapes me. Thank you, Demjanjuk, thank you, was tried and based on captured Soviet records that had referred to captured German records. It's a complicated story, but the bottom line is they had a picture of him, and he was identified and therefore convicted, and later it was considered that this was an improper conviction because it was not a picture of him. He was not a guard at this particular concentration camp, but he was something of a much lower status, and he shouldn't be found guilty. But then he was tried again, and honestly, the later details of that case have escaped me, except I know that it was a very questionable identification, and he was certainly guilty of something, but whether he was guilty of what he was charged with remains, I think, in question. Is there somebody who knows more about that, like to speak to it? No, he's not the only one. There are others who are less famous. Mostly, however, the United States and Canada they decided after the initial famous rounds, they decided to simply deport these people and to prove that they had lied on their visa application to come to the United States. So instead of trying them, they just shipped them back to their country of origin. That's what Canada has done, and the United States, for the most part, has done that. Other questions? Okay, well, I just have one other thing that I want to say, which has nothing to do with the topic, but I had done a beautiful outline of what I was going to say, and I had it color-coded, and the political issues over here and the personal issues over here, and when I went to print it out this morning, my computer ate it. And so I couldn't find it at all, and I had fortunately kept my original notes from when I was, I guess you could call them my field notes, when I was just thinking about the subject. So I say that not to generate sympathy, but just to show you that I took this very, very seriously, and if I had my outline with all the color coding, I could have showed you that, but no. Anyway, thank you very much for your courtesy and for your attention.